Welcome to another edition of Daily Airline News, focusing on the loss of Air India 171 and also, at the moment, the Concorde crash. I'm Geoffrey Thomas, and I'm delighted to say joined by my co-host Richard Godfrey in Frankfurt. Good morning to you, Richard.
And good afternoon to you, Geoffrey.
Thank you. Viewers, this episode is Great Reports, episode 262. Let's start with this lovely statement and then some thoughts on our coverage of the Concorde crash. Francine George, 1142, says, I started my interest in aviation when I was 9 years old and flew on a DC-3 from Montreal to New York, LaGuardia, with my new adoptive parents, my immigration flight. Later, the privilege of being on a Capital Airlines DC-3 that did a successful foam runway belly landing without the landing gear, icing-related failure, in a snowstorm in Michigan from Newark, New Jersey to Lansing, Michigan. Rode on a jet for the first time in 1966. Been involved in aviation in one way or another during my long career with the government, Naval Aviation, Army Aviation, Transport Security Administration, TSA, and the three letters government agencies. Love your analyses, very honest and thorough. And Helen Slade, 1208. What an amazing and great report on the Concorde accident. How is it that this is not generally known? This has been a really interesting episode. Many thanks. And Mary Beth McCoy, the details you related with respect to the Concorde crash are truly eye-opening, as they were never part of the official accounts we were told in the United States. Thanks, Richard and Geoffrey, for another excellent and insightful video and for your continual efforts to expose hidden truths. It's very much appreciated. And John Potter, Kilo 8 Romeo, excellent information on the Concorde crash. I knew some of it from Mike Bannister's book, but you have provided full information. Thank you, gents, for your invaluable contribution to safety in air travel. Richard, some lovely thoughts and lovely comments.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you for those. And there are aspects of the official investigation into the Air France Concorde crash, which was flight AF 4590 back on 25th of July 2000, that are still strongly disputed. And that's been going on now for 25 years, both during and after the various inquiries. The Continental's lawyers called the BEA investigation biased and incomplete. And there is a dispute over whether the titanium strip actually caused the rupture of the fuel tanks or not. And several experts have questioned whether the metal strip's impact alone could have torn the tire in such a way and generated sufficient energy to rupture the fuel tank and cause a massive shock wave inside the tank. Michelin, the tire's manufacturer, argued that BEA in France overemphasized the tire's role and underplayed the fuel tank's fragility. And the French criminal trials between 2008 and 2012 brought even more disputes. But eventually, on appeal, all the criminal convictions against Continental and the mechanic were overturned. And I have to say, eventually the truth will come out.
So, Horatio 776, dear Geoffrey and Richard, once again, many thanks for your continuous efforts to find the truth about AI 171. We must be patient, as Richard has reminded us in today's episode 259. With reference to the reports that John Hutchinson presented many years ago, I fully agree with him. I watched his videos several times and always appreciate his precision, detail and emotion. I clearly remember when he remarked the lack of communication and challenge of the FO to the captain. Captain, we cannot do that. His challenge did not happen when the captain decided to take off with a tailwind and lose the advantage of a 16 knot 8 plus from the tail and 8 minus from the headwind. A normal 08 takeoff would have saved the flight. But if you want to go one step further, I would suggest you read the 58-page report of Christian Roger of the A320 Habsheim crash in June 1988, quoted below. But Airbus was under certification process in the USA and had 500 A320s orders in hand. That, as the report correctly identifies, is a raison d'etre, or reason for state, in France and in other countries. But in my humble opinion, this is just a crime. An episode about that crash can be really fascinating. This case shows how, even in central countries like France, financial and industrial interests fly on top of the truth. Richard, that's a serious comment.
It is indeed, and covers a lot of ground, talking about Air India 171, and then about the Concorde crash, and then about the A320 crash at an air show in France. And we are planning an episode on the Habsheim air show crash of the Airbus A320, which happened back on the 26th of June, 1988. The A320 Habsheim crash is hotly disputed even now, 37 years later. There have been 10 different investigations. The first one was by the BAER, the official report from the French Air Accident Investigation Bureau. Then there was a French judiciary investigation. Then there were criminal court proceedings, civil court proceedings, an Airbus internal inquiry, an Air France internal inquiry, and there was even a European Court of Human Rights inquiry. So it's been through a lot of different investigations, this particular accident. And even the NTSB was involved in the original official investigation because the CFM 56-5A1 engines on the aircraft were built by a joint venture between GE in the US and Snecma in France. I've recently reread the BAER 74-page report and also the dissenting 58-page report from Christian Roger. And the pilot of the Airbus A320, Michel Asselineau, stumbled out of the blazing wreck at the time, saying the engines failed to pick up. And the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder were both recovered from the crash site. But the Roger report claims the data was manipulated. Christian Roger was an advisor in the defense of Captain Michel Asselineau. And Roger was a flight captain with Air France, he's now retired, and he was the former president of the French Pilots Union, the Syndicat National des Pilotes de Ligne, from 1986 to 1990. And you have to remember, back in 1988, there was no GPS data on an aircraft and no ADS-B data published. And the Fairchild F800 flight data recorder captures around a couple of hundred different parameters: the flight data, altitude, rate of climb, speed and track, the position of all the flight controls, the engine data, the communications and navigation data, and the inertial reference data from which the position of the aircraft is calculated. And we have the full CVR and ATC transcript, so we know exactly where the plane took off and where it crashed. We have the radar trace and the VOR and DME data. And we have the Airbus A320 and the CFM 56 engine performance data. And even if we cannot rely on the FDR data because some people claim it was manipulated or changed, we can still reconstruct the flight path and we can compare how the aircraft actually flew when compared with how it should have flown, according to the Airbus Performance Manual. So the bottom line is, was this an Airbus problem or a pilot error? Was the pilot showing off on a low, slow flight over the air show? Or did the aircraft fail to pick up, as the captain stated when he survived the wreckage? And when the captain hit the toga button at the end of the low speed flyby, how quickly did the engines pick up? And these questions can be answered quite precisely. And did the crash occur because the aircraft was flown far too low and far too slow, with idle thrust and high drag, leaving no energy margin for recovery? Or was it because the Airbus or the engine failed? And I plan a flight reconstruction second by second with the aircraft's weight, the wind, the temperature, air pressure, flap setting, landing gear, approach idle, approach velocity, and the alpha protection and floor protection that an Airbus has, and basically using the Airbus book data. And hopefully this will definitively answer the question, was the pilot in error? Or was there an issue with the aircraft or engines? Or was there wind shear over the forest at the end of the flyby? Or perhaps even a combination of all of these factors?
Mm. Richard, I always understood that it was a mode confusion issue was the overriding takeaway from the investigation.
And that was one point made in the official report, but
Mm,
that's contradicted in other reports. So
yeah.
um, I think it depends which report you last read, frankly, which conclusion you come to.
Well, I think I'll wait for your report. How's that?
All right. Well, let's see what we come up with.
Yeah, absolutely. Philip Dartnell says, I sat through a series of lectures on Concorde in 2018 by an ex-Concorde pilot, Captain Rick Reynolds. It was truly excellent and covered the crash in detail. This is the Air France crash. One of the things he addressed was the French legal system and its overpreponderance on finding an individual or individuals to blame in the case of a transport accident, typically the driver of a car or trucks or trains, the captain for a maritime accident, and pilots for an aircraft crashes. He gave numerous previous examples of complex air accidents where pilots were blamed even though the operators, ATC, manufacturers and regulators all had a hand in helping the Swiss cheese holes to line up. And at the last time of his lecture, the UK AAIB had refused to endorse the French BEA final report as it just didn't address all the other factors in the accident: missing spacer on the gear, overfilled tanks, aircraft overweight, downwind takeoff, engine 2 shut down below 400 feet, etc. But instead was heavily focused on the strip of titanium that fell off the preceding DC-10 as the cause. It left me aware that even an advanced developed nation can have extreme flaws in their investigative process and legal systems. The engineer who installed that strip of titanium on the DC-10 went through a decade of hell to clear his name and have the French authorities back off trying to get him extradited as being the main person that caused the Concorde Air France 4490 crash. And even now, ask someone what caused the Concorde crash, and they'll likely say a strip of metal fell off a DC 10. An appalling outcome for all involved, but a classic example of the French not wanting to own up to their failings. Now, Richard, of course, this is my understanding is Napoleonic law, and the Italians do the same thing.
Yeah, there are lots of countries. We talked about the South African Helderberg,
Mm,
where again the investigation was dominated by judges and lawyers. Um, I think air accident investigations need to be dominated by air and aviation and accident expertise.
mm,
Obviously, there'll be medical factors. Obviously, there'll be weather factors. But it's not just a legal battle, an investigation.
And the
And
problem, if I can just intercede on that same thing, the problem with a legal situation where the police want to find a culprit is that that culprit will then keep quiet and say nothing. It goes into a 3 and 4 year legal battle, and the real cause of the accident is not known for sometimes years.
yeah, and we've been through a large number of investigations which have been overturned,
Mm,
or even years later are still not finally resolved.
mm,
Um, and I'm mindful of the discussions we've had with Captain Kevin Sullivan,
yeah.
and he said yesterday, "Well, it's always easy to blame the pilot."
Mm,
If you don't find any other cause
mm,
in the engines or the systems or in the maintenance or the operations, and especially if the pilots unfortunately are killed in the crash,
mm,
then they're not even there to defend themselves.
yeah. Yeah.
In this case, it took 12 years for John Taylor, the Continental mechanic, to clear his name. But having cleared his name in the courts, the media still carried on and
Mm,
blaming him. And the Bayer official accident report in 2004 on the Concorde crash attributed the crash to a chain of design vulnerabilities. It didn't actually uh, say it was an individual negligence. But the French prosecution constructed a narrative that the public, meanwhile, over the years, have internalized. And for nearly a decade, the narrative was a negligent US mechanic caused Concorde's only crash. And even after he cleared his name in 2012, I have a few quotes from the French media for you. The titanium strip that caused the crash. One quote. Another one, the continental mechanic involved. Another quote, the part installed improperly. Another quote, and they were carrying on. So
mm.
even when the trial is completed in the criminal courts, the trial by media continues. And in my view, aircraft accident investigations is a matter requiring aviation experts and cannot be left to legal experts on their own, and it certainly cannot be left to the general media.
Yes, and on the subject of beer, certainly there's been some criticism of them in the past. But recently, I think their investigation of Air France 447, which was an Airbus aeroplane, Air France, it was all French. I thought that was very good. And then their coverage of the Ethiopian MAX crash, I thought was outstanding, where they called out the Ethiopians for not for leaving so much important material out of the accident investigation. So I think things have changed there considerably.
Yeah, things have changed at Bayer over the years
Mm.
considerably. And, we go back to these older accidents on the Concorde and the Airbus at A320 at Habsheim. These are still hotly disputed, but
Mm.
you're quite right. Air France 447, I think, was a masterpiece of investigation
Yep.
and really top notch.
Mm.
And actually, I would recommend the Air France 447 investigation as a model of how to do an investigation and how to get it right.
Yeah, absolutely. So John Isley, 4578, brings us back to Air India. I was briefly perplexed for a moment concerning AI 101. I initially believed it to be AI 101, a 707-437 that crashed into Mont Blanc in 1966, resulting in the loss of 117 lives. Thank you once more for an excellent episode. But Richard, tragically, Air India lost two aircraft into Mont Blanc. Air India Flight 245 was a scheduled Air India flight from Bombay to London via Cairo and Geneva. On the morning of the 3rd of November 1950, the Lockheed 749 Constellation crashed into Mont Blanc, France, while approaching Geneva. All 48 aboard were killed. Richard.
Yeah. So we're not just talking about Air India Flight 171 recently.
Mm.
We're going back in history.
Mm.
The first one you mentioned, or John mentions, is Air India Flight 245. And as you
Yep.
say, that was a Lockheed Constellation
Mm.
back in 1950.
Mm.
And that crashed into the Rocher de la Tournette at 4,677 meters high in the Mont Blanc Massif on the French side. 48 fatalities. It was stormy weather, poor visibility, and the aircraft struck terrain. Details of the instrumentation and navigation are not very well documented. And interestingly, over the years, debris from that crash has been emerging from the Bosson Glacier as it's been melting, and engine parts and mail bags have been found. And on the other incident, India Flight 101, and happened in 1966 with 117 fatalities, that investigation pointed to a miscalculation of position. And they thought they had passed over the mountain when they hadn't. And one of the VOR receivers on the aircraft was unserviceable. And again, debris and mail bags and jewelry and human remains have been revealed as the Bosson Glacier has melted over the years. And both accidents occurred in exactly the same region of the Mont Blanc in the French Alps, and both were controlled flight into terrain on approach and descent toward Geneva. 9 nautical miles after a waypoint called BANKO, and the two crashes were only 3 nautical miles apart. And the first flight, 3 nautical miles off the flight route, and the second one, 6 nautical miles off the flight route. The flight route called Y52, which takes you into Geneva. So interesting investigations, and
Mm.
thank you to the viewers and John Isley pointing that out.
Mm. Now, Mark Howlett 9951 brings us back to the Concorde again. Please do an episode on Concorde. Most people think it was a perfect aircraft, but it had a very checkered past. Shredding tyres was a known issue, also pieces of the tail falling off. In fact, when it comes to fatalities, the Concorde had the worst crash record of any aircraft, and it was plagued by a variety of incidents. Overall, the Concorde record was 90 incidents and one crash, and the tyre damage to the fuel tanks was certainly a known issue after a 1979 incident at Dulles International Airport. So not a good record.
Not a good record.
No. Now, Brad Kepler 6615, Richard and Geoffrey, I respect the work you guys have put into these videos in trying to figure out the cause of the accident. However, you guys leave out multiple pieces that hold significant value. The first being why the fuel cutoff switches were moved to cut off immediately after takeoff. For sake of argument, let's say an electrical issue caused the engines to fail, like you guys have both claimed. Per the 787 Flight Crew Instructions Manual, in the event of a dual engine failure, both cut-off switches go from cut-off to run once reaching a safe altitude. The preliminary report stated that the cut-off switches were shut off left to right with a 1 second gap between the two. When the cut-off switches were moved to cut-off, the plane was not at a safe altitude. The only interaction listed in the preliminary report was the FO asking the captain why he cut off, with zero mention of an engine failure.
Thank you for your comment, Brad, but I have to say I reject your false accusation entirely. We do not leave out multiple pieces of information that hold significant value. We've actually discussed the fuel switches 129 times in almost every episode on Air India crash. So I suggest you go and watch them because, Brad, we can't watch the episodes for you. You have to do that yourself.
Yeah, and there are quite a few episodes, Brad, and I can assure you we've mentioned those switches ad nauseum. In fact, we've almost devoted a couple of episodes specifically to the switches, have we not, Richard?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
also the quote on the standard operating procedure memory item for a dual engine failure on takeoff is misquoted. The words "wait till you get to a safe altitude" are not actually in the Boeing wording, so it's a misleading comment.
And I think from the preliminary report, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, I've read it so many times, but we don't actually know who said what, and it's not a direct quote either.
It's not a direct quote. We don't know what the pilots were referring to. Cutoff could have meant cutoff on the displays,
That's
or the
right.
instruments might not have been in relation to cutoff on the fuel switches.
Hmm.
And that's a key point. And Brad mentions the preliminary report, but the preliminary report has got so many vague statements and leaves out so many important pieces of information. It is, in fact, designed to be misleading
Hmm.
and obviously has successfully misled a lot of people.
Yeah. So, Richard, KC 4619, might you please comment regarding any possible legal pathways forward that could compel the AAIB India to specifically address your published AI 171 disaster root cause analysis? Richard, that's an interesting question.
Yeah, but there is no legal obligation on the AAIB India to read our paper on the root cause analysis. I would add that meanwhile, that paper has been downloaded several thousand times,
Mm,
and there are a lot of people reading it,
mm,
including a whole bunch of people from India or with names that are quite clearly Indian origin names. So I'm sure the AAIB India are well aware of the existence of our paper, but there is no legal obligation.
Now, Ashok Gupta, India 9 Whiskey. Great work. Your knowledge is unmatched. That's nice. I need to understand. 1. Electrical protection for short circuit in 787. If it is a breaker, it can be reset, but if a fuse, it has to be replaced. There was a stabilizer issue in Delhi, on the Delhi to Ahmedabad flight, which was rectified at Ahmedabad. Seems engineer bypassed it and did not remove cores in short circuit. This could be a reason for all standby power blowing out. Only rat power survived due to powering only essential instruments. It's a little bit disjointed, Richard, but I think you get the gist of it all.
Yeah, well, let's try and lay it out step by step.
Mm.
There are a number of circuit breakers on the Boeing 787, but these are used for high power loads and not the normal system loads, electrical loads. And the normal electrical loads are protected by solid state protection, not circuit breakers. There are actually no fuses on a Boeing 787. The RPDUs use traditional thermal magnetic circuit breakers, but they are remotely actuated and they're used on the power distribution system. And all the normal system loads, so avionics and lighting, computers, valves, etc., use solid state power controllers, SSPCs. We know the horizontal stabilizer is on the same DC power buses and the same AFDX data bus link as the throttle control module and the electronic engine control modules. And we also know the fault was a temporary fault and not a permanent fault. And how do we know that? Because both engines were successfully relit. So there was no damage to the engine, no problem with the fuel supply, and the fault that caused the engine shutdown, the dual engine shutdown, went away. So it was a temporary fault. And we believe it was a glitch in the data link between the throttle control module and the electronic engine control modules in each engine. And that's well documented in the Boeing and GE documentation. So it wasn't a question of a complete blow up of the power or a fuse breaking and not being replaced. It's a question of a glitch on the electrical system caused by water ingress, which in turn caused the data link to drop out, but then subsequently be restored.
Richard, let's conclude with these two comments. Mark Munro, 131. I'm staggered by the quality of your podcast and the associated analysis. They are truly outstanding. Thank you. I had always believed that formal aircraft investigations were definitive. Clearly not. Why is this so? What processes should be evolved and what additional data should be collected from the aircraft to make conclusions indisputable? And Richard, this is from a global expert in aviation safety. Sumin Chowdhury, 4957. Richard and Geoffrey, thank you very much for your very interesting and informative sessions you have been holding so diligently. As regards your emphasis on honest and impartial investigation of accidents and incidents, I must emphasise that morality is a very subjective question. What is high moral and impartial in one eyes is highly immoral, unjust and inappropriate in another's point of view. I'm a retired aeronautical engineer and have worked as chief continuing airworthiness engineer for a major US aeronautical product manufacturer. I know the workings of the FAA, the NTSB, and EASA, and other international certification and investigation agencies. You cannot disassociate politics and subjectivity in an international investigation platform. They know best, and others, third world or communist countries, know less, and are always compromised. Though Richard's position and presentation is honest and upright and, of course, intelligent, the world operates differently in reality. I could provide you with umpteen examples of deceptions and deceits by your so-called honest agencies that you trust so much. Nevertheless, the points you make are true, justified, and you deserve credit for being so thorough and honest with your approach. Please accept my great appreciation for what you two are doing. Richard, a fantastic comment.
Yeah, but it's a bit of a loaded comment as
I
well.
know, I know.
It, it's I think we have to be very careful what we state publicly,
Mm.
and we have to provide evidence for any claims that we make publicly. Soman, in my response, in case you were wondering, we have not lost our sense of reality. We have never called all government aviation agencies honest. By contrast, we have pointed out a large number of flawed investigations and even failed investigations or investigations that were subsequently overturned. And what we're trying to do is to restore a sense of reality in aircraft accident investigations. And both Geoffrey and I are very familiar with the workings of Airbus and Boeing and NASA and FAA and EASA and the NTSB and the AAIB in the UK and BEA and AAIB India and so on. We could go on and on and on. And we've listed a number of and done episodes on a number of investigations which were quite clearly flawed. So, in summary, all is not what it seems. And we agree with you on that point, Soman.
Yeah, indeed. Every now and again we have to bite our tongue, don't we, Richard, because we can't say what we'd like to say.
Yeah.
But for the viewers, just to add a little bit of context to this, Soman's expertise is actually in helicopters, and he headed up a international safety team that has reduced helicopter accidents by approximately 30 to 40%. So obviously he's a very highly qualified gentleman, and so his praise is deeply appreciated. So Richard, thank you very much indeed for the great work you've done on this particular episode.
You're very welcome.
Yeah. And viewers, we'll be back tomorrow with more on Air India 171. And we do appreciate your support. Please subscribe to us if you don't already. Please keep those likes coming and those wonderful comments coming. And please do keep those fantastic questions coming, even though they do challenge us every now and again. And we do look forward to your company tomorrow. Thank you very much.